Welcome back to Protestant Bros, and today we're going to continue the topic of slavery, what we find in the Old Testament. We're going to analyze these laws, these texts that talk about slavery, and we're going to try to reconcile them. We're going to figure out what's going on. So, starting with Exodus chapter 12, verse 49, one law shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you. You can also find this in Leviticus 24, verse 22, and Numbers chapter 15, verses 15 and 16. So I start off with this because for both the Israelite and the stranger, they are under one law. Okay, so if the stranger is living, in the land, and for the Israel living in the land, one law. And the best case for this, we could read Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 10. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. So, I know a lot of people like to skip over the fourth commandment, but this is the best case for both the stranger and the Israelite being under the same law. Right, so let's continue into the slave laws. Start with Exodus 21, verse 20 through 21. And if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. So, this is a wild verse if you read it outside its context. Okay, because it sounds like that as long as a man beats his male and female servant to the point where they could stay alive a day or two and then they succumb to their injuries, that's what God is allowing. But if you start the passage at verse 12, there's a pattern where God is first given the punishment for intentional violence, and then he's given punishment or no punishment for unintentional violence. Okay, so God right here, he's just contrasting two types of violences to occur. So for example, if we read verse 12, he who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. However, if he did not lie in wait, but God delivered him into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place where he may flee. Okay, so it starts out with the intentional act of violence and the punishment for that, which is, you get the same punishment for what you deal. And verse 13 is saying, well, if it happened unintentionally, if it happened by accident, then God is going to give you a place where you could go, which is one of the cities of refuge, where you could have your case heard by elders and by the judges, and you could either be exonerated or just depends on what the circumstance was. No different than our legal system, where if you do if you blatantly commit an act of violence, then you have the punishment. And if you fall into like that gray area, then you have your case heard by a judge, and you could either be free from the crime or not free from the crime. Let's look at verse 21. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. Now, I'm going to touch more on property in the later text when we get to Leviticus 25. But first, let's look at verse 28 within this context. If men contend with each other, and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die but is confined to his bed, if he rises again and walks about outside with his staff, then he who struck him shall be acquitted. He shall only pay for the loss of his time, and shall provide for him to be thoroughly healed. And so this is in addition to that, if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. So some scholars, they attribute property to the cost to provide healing for the servant. Okay, so the reason why the master is not punished if the servant stays alive a day or two and then succumbs to the injury is because the master he's maybe did it on accident, and he put his servant through the medical system. He let the servant see the physician, And because of that, this will be something that the judges keep in mind when they hear his case. So it's not like the man is just fully exonerated. It's saying if this situation were to happen, he shouldn't be punished if he's found that it wasn't intentional. But if it was, which we see in verse 20, if a man beats his male and female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. So the first part is dealing with the intentional act of violence against the servant, and the second part is dealing with the accidental one, which if it was an accident and it's found to be an accident by the elders and the judges, then that master would be free from the crime. And it's no different than our legal system today. We have first degree murder, second degree, and third degree. First degree being the worst, which is intentional and premeditated. You also have second degree, which is intentional but not premeditated, and then third degree, which is neither intentional or nor premeditated. Okay, so that's what God is doing here. That's the pattern. He's listing out the consequence for the intentional act and then the consequence for the unintentional act. But what happens if the servant remains alive? If we go to verse 26, if a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for the sake of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth. So in this situation, if the servant lives, from the injuries, they're let go. They're let go from their servitude. They don't have to, fulfill the rest of their duties. So that's what God is doing here. What he's doing, he's restricting punishment that masters deal to the servants so that the masters don't abuse their servant. So this isn't supposed to be read like, well, as long as the man is, as long as the man makes sure that the servant, doesn't succumb to the injuries, after a day or two. No, this is saying, this is describing the consequences for the intentional act and the consequences for the unintentional act. And that's the pattern throughout this passage. So now let's turn to Leviticus chapter 25. So starting with verse 8, and you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, and the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be to you 49 years. Then you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement, you shall make the trumpet to sound throughout all your land. And you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land of all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his possession, and each of you shall return to his family. So I just wanted to establish that first, that in the 50th year, all slaves, all servants in the land were to be freed in the year of Jubilee from their servitude. So this was liberty throughout all the land. And after we read in Exodus 12, one law for the Israelite, one law for the stranger. So now let's turn to Leviticus chapter 25, and I'm going to start at verse 44. I think in the last video, I tackled the other text 39 and 40 when I talked about the Israelites in slavery, but this one we're going to deal with the foreigners. So in Leviticus 25 verse 44, and as for your male and female slaves whom you may have from the nations that are around you, from them you may buy male and female slaves. Moreover, you may buy the children of the strangers who dwell among you, and their families who are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall become your property. And you may take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them as a possession. They shall be your permanent slaves. But regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over one another with rigor. So let's start with verse 44. This verse is just dealing with the fact that Israelites can or are allowed to purchase slaves from other nations. That's it. That's all that this text is saying. Okay, then let's jump down to verse 45. That the children of the strangers who dwell among them, they can take them as their property. So to understand verses 45 to 46, I have to establish what it's talking about when it's saying possession. So number one, the economic system of ancient Israel is not capitalist. So if we put our capitalist perspective, in this situation, where it's going to be chaotic. You can't do it because this is not a capitalist system. Okay, the factors of production belong to God. And that's established in the same chapter, verse 23 and 24. The land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. And in all the land of your possession, you shall grant redemption of the land. So God is the one who distributed the land among the Israelites. We saw that in the book of Joshua, where they distributed the land among tribal lines. Okay, so like Dan and Asher and Simeon and Manasseh and Ephraim, all of them are given lands. Matter of fact, when you read further into like the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, it solely refers to, when it refers to the land, it really refers to the tribe. So it may refer to like Manasseh or Ephraim or Dan. It's referring to the land owned by those tribes or in their possession. So because this is not a capitalist culture or a capitalist economy, the idea of property and possession are very abstract. So when it's talking about property and possession, it's not talking about necessarily the servants or the slaves, that the Israelites directly own the slaves. That wouldn't make sense, because remember, the factors of production are all owned by God. So people are not owning people. It is God who owns people. And God constantly reiterates that these are my servants who I brought out of the land of Egypt. If you go to Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness, the world and those who dwell therein. So when we talk about things like chattel slavery, it's not something that exists in this culture, because people cannot own people. The Israelites don't even own the land that they're living on. They're simply in possession of it. God has given it to them, but they can't even sell it. This isn't the same type of economic system that we have today. This economic system in Israel is completely by God. Okay, it's a command economy and under a theocracy. So when we're talking about, again, property and possession, it's referring to the fact that the slaves that the Israelites buy from foreign nations, they have no claim to any land in Israel, which means they technically have no home. God is telling the Israelites, you are responsible for the people who you buy from other nations if you choose to do that. So if you choose to go and buy a slave from the Philistines, right, they are in your possession. In other words, they are under your supervision. They belong to your land. So let's say, somebody from Judah decides to buy a Philistine, right? That servant belongs to Judah. That servant must be in the possession of Judah, meaning the land that they go to is the land of Judah. It wouldn't make sense for somebody from Judah to purchase a foreign slave, and then that servant is going to another land, to the land of Dan, right? Because Dan only has so much land. So the possession and property he's talking about is to where this servant will go to, who is responsible for this servant, because the foreign servant has no possession of the land. So then even when you go down to permanent slaves, the permanent part is referring to the fact that the Israelites cannot resell the foreign slave to other nations or among themselves. So God is saying he's completely prohibiting slave trade within the Israelite system. So yeah, the Israelites can go and buy a foreign slave. They could go and buy a slave from another nation. But once they come into Israel, they cannot be resold. They belong to whichever tribe has purchased them, and that's what it is. You cannot resell them once they come into Israel, once they come into Israel's territory. So these are actually rights that are really to protect the slave. It's to keep the slave from being resold to other families, to keep bouncing from tribe to tribe. And God is prohibiting slave trade among the Israelites. The only way for an Israelite to become a servant or to become a slave would be for them to sell themselves into that situation, which will be indentured servitude because they owe debts. So nobody here is forcing anybody to be in this servitude. They are freely doing it voluntarily. Now, what options does the foreign servant have? What can they do? Let's say a foreign servant really doesn't like where they're at. What are their options? So number one, they could choose to run away. When we go to Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 15 and 16, you shall not give back to his master the slave who has escaped from his master to you. He may dwell with you in your midst, in the place which he chooses within one of your gates, where it seems best to him. You shall not oppress him. Or they could go to one of the cities of refuge. We established that in Joshua chapter 20, and it's in Numbers, where the cities of refuge were mainly set up for those who committed these heinous crimes, who are trying to escape, punishment, usually for like murder. But if they're going to accept murders, they're most likely going to accept runaway slaves. And then the other option, which I believe is the option that God is really looking at, is for the foreigner to become circumcised. And we already read that in Exodus chapter 12, verse 48, that if a foreigner or a stranger became circumcised, they had access to the same rights as the Israelites. Even though they wouldn't be a blood Israelite, they would have the same rights and access because they were circumcised. This was their physical acceptance of the covenant of God, to be circumcised. And God is allowing this to exist so that God can bring in the foreigner into Israel. Now you have the regular sojourners who maybe merchants or whatever, who can be involved in Israelite culture. But what about the foreign slaves? Because the only way for foreign slaves to even come into Israel, they would have to be purchased. That's what God is doing. He's allowing Israel the opportunity to purchase a foreigner, to bring them into Israel, in hopes that that foreigner can learn the ways of God, can learn the commandments of God, the love of God, and then to become circumcised, not just in flesh, but also in the heart. And then that foreigner, once they're circumcised, they just have to serve 6 years, and they're free in the 7th year. They're free from their bondage. So that's what God is doing. He's allowing access for the foreign slaves, for all people, for the regular foreigner and for the foreign slaves to come in to experience Israel, to experience God, and to hopefully fully accept God as God of gods, Lord of lords. That's what God is looking for. And that really points us to the bigger theme of God's redemption, because that's what Christ does for us. Christ, he died outside the gate. He died for the foreigner, for the sojourner outside the gates, for all of us. And Christ, he purchased the foreign slaves to bring us into Israel, into the fold. Christ became a servant for all of us so that we could experience his kingship. And that's the point of redemption that God is looking at. We can even see this in the law, that's what God is looking for us to become circumcised. And in this case, not physically circumcised, but circumcised in heart. And that's the bigger theme of redemption within the laws of God, that God is bringing in the foreigner. And that's what Christ does for us. Christ is bringing in the foreigner, the sojourner, those who were once alienated from Christ. That's what we're told in Ephesians, who were once alienated from the covenant. Christ has become the circumcision to bring all of us in, that we all have the opportunity to have access to the kingship of Christ.